Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bill Swainson, and I'm a trustee of Litfest. We're a volunteer organisation, so everything that you've seen over the last 10 days has been organised by one of us, or all of us together, or some of us, and all on a volunteer basis. Litfest is fortunate that we are supported by Lancaster City Council. We get occasional grants. We've got one this year that's enabled this and some of the other history events and environment events from the National Lottery Heritage Fund. And we're also supported by local charities and above all by our audiences and supporters. And I'll be coming back to that theme at the end. You will find on your seat a thing called a feedback form. I'd be really grateful if you'd fill that in at the end. It's hugely useful to us in planning for the future, but also reporting back to our various funders and helping us to gain more funds to put on more events throughout the year, as well as at the festivals in the spring and the autumn. So it's an essential, for us, it's an essential tool. Now, that's the end of the parish notices, except to say that this event is being live streamed and recorded, and the video will be available for 30 days afterwards, and our photographer will be taking photographs during the performance. So if anyone is uneasy about being photographed, please raise your hand, Ginny. Find Ginny at the end and just let her know. So welcome to our online audience, and to our in-house audience, welcome to a packed auditorium. This is the main performance space in the Story Institute, Story, which is Lancaster's Arts Centre, and we're very glad today to welcome, I don't think it's an unkindness to say, the veteran journalist, broadcaster and author Peter Taylor, and he'll be talking to Tom Mills. Tom is a lecturer in the Department of History and the Deputy Director of the Centre for War and Diplomacy. And if at the end you think you'd like to study for an MA at Lancaster, you will find a leaflet that you can pick up on the books table just outside. Now, Peter Taylor is, if anyone doesn't know, is the man behind the terrific television documentaries that have appeared, and also at the beginning, Thames TV and BBC News coverage on Northern Ireland since 1972. And I had the good fortune to be an editor working at Bloomsbury when his book Provos was first published, edited by one of the founders of Bloomsbury, David Reynolds, and then his book Loyalists, and it won't surprise you that the third in the trilogy was called Brits, and that I had the good fortune to edit and came out in 2001, and since then Peter has gone on making really good TV programmes, has been awarded many prizes from BAFTA, Lifetime Achievement Awards, and has always wanted to get to the bottom of what happened in the early 1990s and why that eventually led to the Good Friday Agreement. I'm not going to say any more than that, except that the answer is in this book, which he's going to be talking about, and which you can buy, and he will be happy to sign at the end. But the important thing is that this is the most extraordinary first draft history, and it's a gripping tale, as you will soon discover. And Peter is going to do a short presentation about the book, and I hope read a couple of passages from it, which will give you a sense of how the book works. And then he and Tom Mills will have a conversation about some of the themes in the book. And I can see from this packed audience that there's likely to be quite a few questions. So we're going to run the Q&A for about 25 minutes, a bit longer than we usually do. And I'm sure that if you guys run out of questions, which I doubt for a minute you will, Tom will be able to supply some. And I certainly have one I want to ask Peter, but I will hold back. So for now, please join me in welcoming journalist, author and broadcaster Peter Taylor to the stage.
Bill, thank you very much indeed. And I just want to pay tribute to Bill, because not only did he do a brilliant job editing my Brits book, but he did a fantastic job in editing Operation Chiffon, which is a really difficult book to write. And without Bill's input, technologically, I could have managed all the programs, but also in terms of structure and advice and plot development, he was just absolutely brilliant. So thank you very much, Bill. I wouldn't be here, and this wouldn't be here without Bill. I really mean that. First of all, perhaps a very, very short biog. In the early 1970s, I knew nothing about Northern Ireland. I had a sort of vague idea where it was. I had a vague idea that at some stage the island had been divided. I didn't know why one place, Derry, was also called Londonderry. I was totally ignorant. And as a young journalist in 1972, I felt guilty that I went to Ireland to cover Bloody Sunday, knowing very little about the background, very little about the history. And I felt guilty. I actually got to Derry on Bloody Sunday, the evening of Bloody Sunday, and was horrified at what had happened, and felt guilty that here was me as a young journalist, knowing nothing about how this had happened, why it had happened, where it had come from, what its antecedents were, and critically, the history that lay behind the division of Ireland, which was the root of the current conflict, which has been going on, although we now have a degree of peace. It's not perfect, but it's a huge improvement on the Northern Ireland I found when I first went there as a young journalist in 1972. Subsequently, I became hooked on the Irish question, and I wrote the trilogy Provos, Loyalists and Brits, of which this is really the fourth part, which makes the trilogy a quartet. But there was one question that haunted me throughout my time of reporting Northern Ireland, a question that really only arose once I started examining the so-called back channel. The back channel was the secret metaphorical channel. There wasn't actually a sort of channel as such. The metaphorical channel of communication between the British government in the form of the intelligence service, primarily MI5 latterly, and initially MI6 and its agent Michael Oatley, the communication between the British and the IRA leadership, Martin McGuinness latterly, but his predecessors in the 1970s. The back channel starts in 1974 after the failure of all this is in the book if you're really interested. After the failure of the first attempt for the British to engage the IRA, there were subsequent events that also fell apart because the two sides were so distant, there was no room for compromise. It was only in the end, towards the end of the 1980s and beginning of the 1990s, that both sides were exhausted. Both sides, the British and the IRA, the Republicans, recognized that neither side was going to win, that the Brits weren't going to defeat the IRA, and the IRA recognized, and never said it publicly, obviously, the IRA recognized that it was not going to defeat the Brits. So what do? Do you carry on killing each other? Or do you try and reach some sort of compromise? And what the back channel had been trying to do since 1974, when Michael Oatley was the MI6 officer, and Brendan Duddy, of whom you'll hear more later. Brendan Duddy was the key link between Martin McGuinness and McGuinness's predecessors and the British government. So the back channel was used to try and finally work out some kind of solution. In early 1990s, the back channel is reignited when Robert replaces Michael Oatley from MI6, Robert being MI5, and he becomes the center of a secret operation called Operation Chiffon. Now, the point of Operation Chiffon, it had two goals. First goal was to get the IRA to call a ceasefire, because without a ceasefire, there could be no agreement. The British could not talk to the IRA in terms of working out a settlement publicly without there being a ceasefire. So ceasefire was the first point of Chiffon. The second point was, having got a ceasefire, if that was possible, that there should be talks. In other words, the IRA had to agree to a ceasefire and then give up its so-called armed struggle and embrace the political process. And that is what happened at the Good Friday Agreement 25 years ago next month. And without that ceasefire, and without Robert, whom I argue was initially instrumental in encouraging the IRA to declare that ceasefire, without that, there would have been no ceasefire, in my view, without Robert and the encouragement he gave to the IRA. And without the ceasefire and the end of violence, there would have been no Good Friday Agreement. So that is a very thumbnail sketch of the linear history of Operation Chiffon, what went before it, when the platform for Chiffon was built through the 70s and the 80s, through to the ceasefires, the two ceasefires, and the Good Friday Agreement. So that's enough about me and the background, but I just thought I'd read you a couple of passages from the book. The book took me roughly a year to write with Bill's help, and it emerged from the second time I met Robert. The first time I tracked him down because this had become an obsession. You know, who is this man who apparently told the IRA, as the British government representative, that the British were looking towards a united Ireland? I couldn't believe that he'd actually said this. So the only way I could establish whether or not he had was to find him, and it was finding him that was the problem. The first time I managed to set eyes upon him, to his enormous surprise and horror, was in 1999 when Bill and I were doing Brits. And I tracked him down, introduced myself, told him who I was, and he said, "You've got the wrong man. I'm not the person you're looking for." And that was it. So I went away, you know, crestfallen, felt that I'd failed, was disappointed. And then, out of the blue, 2 years ago, I got a letter. And the letter was from Robert. And he said, "You may remember me," not of. And he said, "If you want to fill in some gaps, then I might be able to help, because three things sadly have happened, or three things have happened. One is two of my key contacts have died, Brendan Duddy and Martin McGuinness. And latterly, and most importantly, my wife has died, and his wife hated him working in Northern Ireland. She feared that one day he would never return home. She couldn't bear about it. When his wife found out that I'd made the visit, she was apoplectic. She was horrified. She was terrified. So that's when I began. That's when I met Robert and did a series of interviews with him that took, you know, a long time to arrange and a long time for him to actually be prepared to do. It was after that I started writing the book. So these are a couple of extracts, and the central piece of the story about Robert, the book's about much more than Robert. It's about what leads up to Robert. Is that when he meets the IRA and says this island will be as one. Now, the meeting had been arranged between the British and the IRA, and it was a meeting that was, you know, official, but very unofficial because it was in the shadows. It was still under deep cover. But it was, the British agreed to the meeting with the IRA because the British wanted to suss out what the IRA had in mind, what sort of compromises they were prepared to make. And on the same side, the IRA wanted to suss out the Brits via Robert to see what the Brits were prepared to do to reach a settlement. So it was a really important meeting. But 3 days before that, the IRA exploded 2 bombs in Warrington, close by, that many of you I'm sure will remember, tragically killing 2 young boys. After that happened, the government made it clear to MI5 and to Robert that they could not go to the meeting. The meeting could not possibly happen because of the public outrage, if it ever became known, that the British had met the IRA 3 days after the Warrington bomb. So the first passage is describing the background to that meeting and what happened when Robert was told he couldn't go. John Chilcot and Quentin Thomas were the two senior officials at the Northern Ireland office, okay? To Robert's consternation, because of Chilcot and Thomas's decision that the involvement of any intelligence officer would be, quotes, unwise, Deverill was Robert's MI5 boss in Northern Ireland. Deverill told Robert that the evening's meeting with the IRA could not now take place. Robert suspected in retrospect that it was likely that Deverill had raised the question in order to give himself the escape route he wanted. Deverill's career was still on the rise, and helping bring peace to Northern Ireland would have been his crowning achievement and likely to elevate him further. Robert feared that if things went wrong, he, Robert, would be finished, as would be the close relationship between MI5 and the Northern Ireland office. Robert felt angry and let down. He told Deverill it was an appalling decision to take at this stage. He rang Brendan from Deverill's office in an anonymous annex at Stormont to warn him that he, Robert, would now be coming on his own and that John Deverill wouldn't be with him. So just to cut the story short, he goes along, meets McGuinness. McGuinness is furious, and Kelly that there's only one Brit, because there were supposed to be two IRA, two Republicans and two Brits. So that's the first problem. And John Deverill was supposed to be coming to the meeting with Robert. Robert says, "I thought, John, how can you be so detached? And I'm here sweating blood. Here I am at the end of the phone arguing with this nearly berserk Brendan," because Brendan Duddy had just rung saying, "You've got to come, the boys are in town." In other words, they're waiting for you. He was getting more and more excited. Worse things were going to happen if I didn't come. "You'll lose the chance," he said, "and you'll lose me." He repeated the IRA leaders will expect 2 British representatives and would back out otherwise. He was throwing everything into it. Anyway, I said to John Deverill, "I'm sorry, I'm going to go." John was not turning a blind eye. He'd given me categoric instructions that I was not to go. I said it was me or nothing, and he reluctantly agreed. I thought, right, that's it, and off I went. For reasons of time, I'm going to skip the next passage, but just read to you something which is really important, because the question is, one of which I'll try and answer, is, did the IRA take what he said seriously? Answer, yes, because the IRA believed that Robert was the British government representative, and therefore he was speaking on behalf of the British government, which of course he wasn't, although that was his title and that was his role. And at the end of the day, when all this comes out, that Robert had secretly met Martin McGuinness and Kelly, disobeying all the orders after the Warrington bomb, he decided the only thing to do, because of the embarrassment he caused, was to resign, to fall on his sword. And so he was deeply depressed and felt guilty at all the trouble that he caused. And then, surprisingly, he got a letter after he'd resigned. He got a letter from Patrick Mayhew, who was the Northern Ireland Secretary. And Mayhew wrote, it's a handwritten letter, of which I have a copy, and I quote in the book. He says, "Dear Fred," and Fred was the code name that the IRA gave to Robert. They didn't know him as Robert, they knew him simply as Fred. So Mayhew says, "Dear Fred, I do not want to allow your career to conclude, and I know it has been distinguished by great dedication and courage, without expressing to you my personal admiration and thanks for your service. Great events frequently claim casualties, as those who try to play a part in shaping them come to realize. It is important not to permit them to distort the true perspective of their enterprise in which they are sustained, and especially so when the casualties include ourselves. In time, I am confident that peace, properly attained, will come to Northern Ireland, and that is what matters most to all of us. With my very best wishes, yours sincerely, Patrick Mayhew." And that really is evidence of how the government, how Patrick Mayhew regarded the crucial work that Robert had done. That's more than enough for me, I'm afraid. So now, okay. Over to Tom.
thank you ever so much, Peter. I feel like Bill enormously privileged to be able to welcome you here to Lancaster, and that you're speaking about your book in this setting, given the very high levels of interest in your book this weekend. And I know you've had a very busy schedule, so thank you for being here. I sense with the audience so full and such interest in the subject, there will be questions. So I'll keep mine fairly brief. But one of the things I find fascinating about history and in your book is this interaction between individuals and these broader historical themes playing out in the background. I think that comes across very well in the book. My question is, what do you think really drove these people? Because particularly the kind of three individuals that you mentioned at the core of the story, including Michael Oakley, Brendan Duddy, but particularly Robert, these are people who have risked enormous amount, risked their careers, lost their career in Robert's case, and were risking their lives in a real sense. What was really driving them to go so far as to disobey orders, as to put everything on the line? What was behind that?
Well, in terms of Robert, who's the sort of centre, in terms of can you hear me? No. Yeah. In terms of Robert, who is the key character in this stage of the book, he's driven by the desire to try and do the impossible, although he, being a very modest person, didn't sort of shout it from the rooftops, but he believed he could do it. I remember asking him in the documentary last night, which some of you may have seen, did you think you could do it? Did you think you could bring peace? And he simply said, I didn't see why not. And he's a remarkable man, and it took me quite some time to get to know him, because the first time he blanked me completely, and despite my attempts to get him to admit who he was, I failed miserably. But when I got to know him, when I met him for the second time after he'd sent me this remarkable letter, he was just entirely different. He's old school. He's a gentleman, if you like, which is why he resigned after the political roof fell in, after the revelation that the Brits had actually met McGuinness. So he was driven to try and achieve what appeared to be the impossible, and had been impossible for the preceding 20-odd years. He's very calm, he's very sensible, he's softly spoken, he's somebody that you feel you can trust, and I had to trust him and he had to trust me to do the interviews, the remarkable interviews for the book. So he had a job to do, and the job was, as he was in charge of making or trying to make Operation Chiffon work, his job was to get a ceasefire and to get the IRA to engage in talks, which, remarkably, is what eventually happened in terms of Good Friday. I mean, that's my thesis, and others will disagree, but I think there is a sort of linear change. On Brendan Duddy, Brendan was devoted passionately to trying to bring peace. And I remember him telling me in a long night over several glasses of Irish whiskey, which I don't normally drink whiskey, of going out and shooting a beautiful hare and seeing the hare dying with the hare's blood covering the snow. And he says, that's what made me a pacifist. It really, really hit him. So Brendan's aim was to get peace. That was Michael Oakley's aim in the preceding 2 decades. And Martin McGuinness, who is misunderstood, Martin McGuinness, his job was to, he was walking a tightrope. Everybody in these 3 people, this trilogy, were walking tightropes because it was so dangerous. So it was difficult. Sammy, ask another question. Yeah.
No. I mean, in terms of Northern Ireland more generally, you obviously we kind of conclude with the Good Friday Agreement in where we got to in the book, and I'm just wondering about your sense of the public engagement with Northern Ireland more generally. And I think in the case of conflicts, particularly kind of internal conflicts, there's often this tension between the need to remember, to commemorate, and to record through history, against the kind of need not quite to forget, but to move on. so that there can be a kind of positive way forward. I just wonder where you think we are with Northern Ireland. It struck me it clearly was a high in people's political consciousness throughout the Troubles. When you get to the Good Friday Agreement, there was a sense of moving on and not focusing on it. It's come back into our consciousness through an unexpected route, through Brexit recently. Where do you think it sits now? And I just wonder what your thoughts are on forgetting and remembering as you're doing in the book.
Well, pardon me. There is peace. The peace is still fragile, as we've seen from recent attacks by the IRA, dissidents of the so-called new IRA. So there's still a threat to the peace process. The biggest threat is the threat of political instability. There is no devolved institution in Northern Ireland. The DUP, so far, have refused to accept the Windsor Agreement, and therefore they are blocking any reconstitution of the Northern Ireland Assembly. There is no democracy in Northern Ireland. And my concern would be, this is the central political issue at the moment. Without a devolved assembly, there is no democratic accountability. Ministers have to decide everything. And it just seems to me that there's a danger that what the DUP are doing by holding out against the Windsor Declaration and stopping the reinstitution of the Northern Ireland Assembly is apparently making Northern Ireland more ungovernable. Given that the majority of people in Northern Ireland did not vote for Brexit, there is a danger that inadvertently the DUP may be pushing the process towards eventual unification, if that ever happens, without them realizing it. And that's the conundrum that's got to be settled. And I'm surprised that we still have an impasse, because I had thought that the DUP, I've got to choose my words very carefully, I would have thought the DUP would have not embraced, but reluctantly perhaps embraced the Windsor arrangement as the lesser of two evils, if you like, and would have got political return for their decision, which would have been, under the circumstances, really quite a brave decision for the DUP to enter into the devolved institutions again. So it's not good. It's dangerous. It's a threat of political instability, which plays into the hands of the dissidents and those who are non-dissident, who just think this is we've got a stalemate again. We've had so many stalemates, so it's got to be resolved in some way. And how that is, I'm glad I'm not a politician.
Okay, I can sense that last answer particularly may elicit some questions from the audience. So I will move to that. I'm just going to ask you one more before I do, and it's more about your personal interest in Northern Ireland. You said you got hooked on the place, on the conflict that was going on there as a young journalist in the 1970s, and then you have this fascinating story as this sort of unscratched itch, that not quite being able to put this piece in the puzzle, which you've finally been able to do. Have you reached a resolution in your interest with Northern Ireland, or is there still more to do you think?
It's a question I'm asked more than once nowadays. Like Peter, isn't it time for you to retire? You've done the documentary, you've written the fourth part of the quartet. Hang up your microphone or your laptop and your iPhone. The straight answer is I don't know, and I think my view is, as long as the conflict remains unresolved, there will be things to do. There will be things to try and explain to an audience perhaps not unlike yourselves, who want to understand what is happening, what the blockages are, what the chances of progress are. And I think, and I've said this to the BBC, and I think the BBC recognises this. If they hadn't, they wouldn't have given me half an hour last night on BBC Two. That a large section, I think, a larger section than it's given credit for, of the license payers, and I hope you're all license payers, I'm sure you are, expect not just Strictly Come Dancing, which I love, and call the midwife, which I also love with my partner, but things like, serious pieces of current affairs journalism and analysis that help the audience, which is you and me too, because I, have to work it out with my producer and things, how it can best be presented to you. You want to know, and that's part of the BBC's public service broadcasting remit. And I passionately believe in that. So as long as the conflict continues, if there are ways in which I can help illuminate the situation in which we find ourselves and possible ways out, then I would like to carry on doing it and hope the BBC would want me to.
I hope so very much too. We do have some time for questions. It's quite dark where I'm looking out with the lights on us, so do wave frantically if you'd like to ask a question. Otherwise, I have plenty more. But I can see, one hand at the back. I think was the first.
And I will bring the microphone to you because we need the microphone for your question to be recorded on the live stream.
Is that live?
Yeah, we've got you. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Peter, for that. It's very fascinating. When I was listening to you, the question I had was Robert, the agent, effectively stated a position that wasn't the government position at the time. Now, I just wonder, when did he have the thought to take that line? Was it something that occurred to him in the meeting, or was it something he'd thought of in advance?
He'd obviously given some thought to it, because it was even more serious because John Deverill, his MI5 boss, wasn't coming with him, so he was entirely on his own. He knew basically what he had to do, which is to persuade, encourage the IRA to move, first of all, towards a ceasefire. And how was he going to do that? What was the argument he was going to put forward? So I think the actual wordings, which were recorded by Jerry Kelly in the minutes, which I recorded again in the book, I think it's something he sort of not made up on the spot, but I think he was flying by the seat of his pants, because here he is on his own in enemy territory, or just on the fringe of enemy territory, because Brendan Duddy, at whose house this meeting took place, lived outside the Bogside. He was uncertain how he was going to put it, so I think he was flying a bit by the seat of his pants in saying what he did. So he was confident, and again, I write about this in the book. Didn't have time to read you the passage, but there's a really nice bit. I said to him when I was interviewing Robert, I said, "But how did you feel? Here you are on your own, faced with Martin McGuinness, who, although he would deny he was IRA at the time, Martin McGuinness, in my view, was always one of the most senior and important figures in the Republican movement in the IRA and Sinn Féin. And he's a formidable character. If any of you saw the documentary last night, there are two faces to McGuinness. He can be charming and polite, but also he can turn just like that and has the most steely blue eyes. And he'd already given Robert the 5th degree, whatever degree it is, before the meeting began, and said, "You must be MI5 or MI6, who are you, what do you want," etc. So it was pretty formidable for Robert to face McGuinness and Kelly, and he had to work out what he was going to say. And he says, and I quoted in the book, he said, "Well, I felt quite confident. I felt I could handle it, and I'd been on stage before at school." It was an old boys' school. I can't say where the school was for obvious reasons. I was in a boys' school, and I played Juliet in Romeo and Juliet. I also played Julius Caesar in Julius Caesar and King Lear. So he played parts in which lots of blood was shed. And he said, but the difference was this time I was playing not to an audience of hundreds of parents at school. I was playing to an audience of 2, and thinking who those 2 people were and what their track records were. It wasn't easy. So he said what he did with great authority. And he believed that he got a ceasefire, and he says this in the interview and in the program last night, that he'd managed to get the IRA to declare a ceasefire. So, he played a blinder. But he shouldn't have been there. He was ordered not to go, and he was certainly not permitted to say those incendiary, excuse the expression, words that he did. But his job is to get the IRA to declare a ceasefire, and I think he felt, and intelligence officers, I think, feel this from time to time, they have to form their words in a way that will have the desired effect on the people they're trying to persuade. I'm a journalist, not an intelligence officer.
It shines a fascinating light on intelligence officers.
It does,
the book, which I know you've spoken to a few of over the years. I think I'm keen to take questions where they are. And then come to you.
Thank you. Hello, Peter.
Hello.
I'd like to come back to something you mentioned earlier about the impasse that we're currently in, and we've rolled from one impasse to another in Northern Ireland for quite some time. What, in your opinion, is the reason why, at the time of the Good Friday Agreement being signed, the popular vote had coalesced very much around the centre ground, if you can call it that, of the UUP and the SDLP, and then within just a few elections' time had very much sort of polarised to the edges with Sinn Féin and the DUP, which many might see as the reason why so many impasses came along subsequently?
I think the catalyst was Brexit. I mean, Brexit was a million miles from anybody's mind in 1994 when the critical meeting took place. What Brexit did was throw the whole cards back up in the air again. And Brexit, for unionists, and I've always tried to understand the unionist position, and although it's sort of fluctuated, and as you say, moderation at the time of Good Friday, because again, like without the IRA ceasefire, without the unionists' agreement to take part, there would have been no Good Friday. So what Brexit did was to intensify the atavistic fear that unionists and unionism and loyalism had always had of perfidious Albion, that in the end the Brits were going to betray the Union and become part of a united Ireland, which is why Robert's words to McGuinness and Kelly were so incendiary, again, excusing the expression. So I think that's why the DUP have taken the hard line, that they see the protocol and Brexit as being a threat to the Union, because a foreign power in the form of the EU is seen to be having a role in Northern Ireland in the same way as over the past 2-3 decades. The fear of unionists was any relationship with Dublin, because that was treachery with the enemy. But if you look at the way that things have evolved since then, the problem is soluble. I think this is more difficult because of the protocol and because of Brexit. So in a short answer, I think the problem has arisen directly as a result of Brexit and the protocol. It's the fear of the atavistic fear that unionists have of a united Ireland. And that may happen at some stage, I think much, much further down the road, I don't know. But that's what the worry is, that's what drives them. And it's the same old question, as I said in the documentary last night. The issue that has governed the past 50 years is, should Northern Ireland remain part of the United Kingdom, which until very recently, until the last census, the majority favoured remaining in the UK, but now it's much more balanced. So that's why it's the old question that's still there, unresolved.
Could I just follow that up? Again, there was quite a jump to Brexit, but it was that time in between when perhaps sort of the politics of Trimble and Hume very much got dropped.
Yeah.
By the popular vote. I wonder why you think that was at a time very soon after the agreement.
I think it's a fairly complicated and long answer, but again, if you look back to the rise of Sinn Féin, Sinn Féin was nothing in the early 1970s when I first started covering Northern Ireland. How Sinn Féin has grown from there, from very little, if anything, to being the largest political party in Northern Ireland and the largest political party on the island of Ireland. That has changed, and that has intensified unionist suspicions. And what tends to happen is the extremes are strengthened. Sinn Féin is now the main nationalist Republican party, and the moderates get squeezed. Although if you look at recent results, and if you look at the results of the census, the centre is much stronger via alliance and more moderate unionist parties than people give them credit for. So, all is chaos, the centre will not hold, but the centre is still there, And I think what we may see as people become increasingly frustrated and fed up with the impasse is to vote for the moderates again. So, we may see the